The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back to the House of Mystery on KKNW 1150 AM Seattle. I'm your host today, Al Warren. Kev Thompson is out sick again, and it's flu season. Now, we're sort of covering a lot about false confessions, and we've been having all sorts of guests, and we're kind of going over cases that have really kind of resulted in bad outcomes. And so we've got someone that knows a lot about the cases and innocence and false confessions, and so we've got him with us today. It's Ken Klonsky. Thank you for being here.
Hi, how are you, Al?
Well, not too bad. So Ken, let's tell the audience a little bit about yourself. Who is Ken, and how did you get involved in false confessions?
Well, it goes back to the early part of 2000s. I was a teacher in Toronto. I live in Vancouver now, and I was a teacher in Toronto, and our class saw The Hurricane together, the film with Denzel Washington about Reuben Hurricane Carter. And he happened to be living in Toronto, and the class wrote to him and invited him to come and speak to us, which, to my surprise, he agreed to do. And it was a transforming experience for all of us. Different for me, of course, than them. For them, it was a validation. These were kids who basically didn't read and write at all. They were disinterested in education. And after he appeared, they turned their lives around. A lot of them, surprising a lot of them. I think all but one of them eventually graduated. So the effect he had on me was I had heard ideas that I had never heard before, and at first I wasn't sure, A, if I understood them, and B, if they were really valid. But after thinking for a while, I invited him to participate in an interview for the Sun magazine that operates out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And he agreed to do the interview, and this interview actually became the seed of our relationship and of my involvement in wrongful convictions. The interview went very well, and a lot of people got to look at it, especially people within prisons, because they distribute for free copies to prisons all over the United States. And one of the people who saw the article was David McCallum, and he was a wrongly convicted young man from Brooklyn who had been convicted with his friend Willie Stuckey through a false confession. And these false confessions of two 16-year-olds were basically the foundation and the entire structure of the case. There was no evidence otherwise that they'd even been to Queens, New York, to do the kidnapping, where the kidnapping originated, that they could even drive a car, and they supposedly had done a carjacking, that they were even capable of getting across the city from Brooklyn to Queens. I know that I had grown up in New York, and even by age 21, I would have had a very hard time driving from one borough like Queens to Brooklyn. So all of it just didn't hang together. David had written to me and said he'd read this interview, and he sent a kind of outline of the case. And I got back in touch with Reuben, and I said, here's a young man who seems to need some help. At the very time Reuben was leaving the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, which is the foundational organization for wrongful convictions in Canada. And he had no place to go. He just left them because of an ethical dispute. And so he needed somebody to go off into the wilderness with him. And since I was working with him at the very beginning, at the very nascent stage of this case of McCallum, Reuben said, well, why don't you join me and I'll start a new organization called Innocence International. So that's essentially the beginning of the work that I did, and that happened around 2004.
Wow. So now, when you take cases on, how is it that you decide who's telling the truth or not? Because there's quite an opinion out there that everybody that gets convicted will say, "Well, I'm innocent," even when they're not. That's kind of a thought that a lot of people have, and I've heard that a lot. What's the determining factors, or are there any, or is it just a feel?
Well, actually, the thought is incorrect. Most prisoners do not claim innocence because innocence can't do you any good whatsoever inside a prison, especially if you are looking for parole. In most cases, if you come before a parole board and say that you did not commit the crime, it's a confirmation to them that you're still a criminal without remorse. So innocence is not often used by prisoners. More bravado is. There's pride in some of the crimes that were committed. But in my experience, innocence is not that common, or claims of innocence. And if it goes on for 15 or 20 years, you get some idea to begin with that the person may well be telling the truth. But that's not a good enough measure, because wrongful conviction work is similar to archaeology. If the initial groundwork gives rise to suspicion that another world lives below the surface, you have to start uncovering the layers that prevent the average person from seeing the truth. Or as Reuben used to say, this defendant, or the person inside the prison, is covered under 1,500 pounds of bullshit. And that's what you have to work through in order to make that decision. Usually it takes about a year.
So now, I was going to say, now I've listened to your book. I didn't read it. I listened. Great book. Now, the Eye of a Hurricane type thing, it was from the Reuben Carter case. What was the biggest surprise you got out of meeting him?
I think that I was awed by his intelligence and his analysis of the world the way it is. Also his metaphysical beliefs. So it's three things that I found quite impressive. He was a brilliant man, and I hadn't expected that because he had no formal education, and he had spent over 30 years in some kind of institution, some kind of penal institution throughout his life. And it didn't lead me to believe that his education was going to be that powerful, but in fact he was autodidact. He in fact was very well educated because he made his prison cell what he called a laboratory of the human spirit, and he read everything about metaphysical, not supernatural by any means, but the whole metaphysical structures of great religious thinkers throughout the 19th and 20th century.
So what was the connection between Reuben Carter and David McCallum?
I was the connection. And in fact, Yeah. As the book Freeing David McCallum, which I wrote after Reuben's death and David's release, that book shows that if there's one function that I had, it was, two functions. One was sticking with the work and not letting discouragement make me give up on what was going on. And the second thing was I had to coordinate the work of a lot of people who were giving of their time and efforts for no money whatsoever. These were some of the top professionals in the United States, and the reason they joined the case was Reuben. His name. He had raised millions of dollars for innocence projects throughout the world, not just North America, but Australia, England. He's very, very well known in that field, more so than he was as a boxer.
Now we're going to bring up a part of the justice system in Canada. Now we're going to talk about the Mr. Big sting operation or technique, depending on what you want to call it. Now this is something that's not allowed in the U.S. or the U.K., but it is in Canada. Now, maybe talk about what that is so the listeners kind of get an idea. What is the Mr. Big sting?
It's, first of all, I don't think it should be allowed in this country, and they have put some restraint on it. I think it's absolutely disgusting. And the RCMP claims there have been very few mistakes, but the problem is that it's very difficult to overturn convictions anywhere. There are people in prison right now in Canada who have been wrongly convicted through this Mr. Big sting. And the way it works is that they get a target, some person who they believe they can persuade and influence and extort a confession out of, because there's nothing more effective to a jury than a confession from a person who may or may not have done a crime. Confessions seem to be airtight. It's counterintuitive to think that somebody would falsely confess to a crime they haven't done. So what Mr. Big does is it convinces, it's an elaborate hoax that convinces, and let's put it personally here, or as Sebastian Burns, that he was part of an underworld gang ruled by this Mr. Big. And if Sebastian cooperated by telling them about the murder he supposedly committed, Mr. Big would control events in his favor. And it not only, he made it clear, Mr. Big, Big Al as his name was at that time, he made it clear that there was evidence being gathered against Sebastian down in Bellevue, Washington, that would tie him to the killing of the Rafay family. But in fact, that was a lie, and they actually produced a false newspaper account and showed it to Sebastian about how the authorities were closing in on him. And even Mr. Big there agreed with him and says, oh, well, this isn't true. But in fact, Sebastian was taken more in by the notion that he had to show solidarity with Mr. Big. He had to say exactly what Mr. Big wanted him to say. Now, one of the ways they make this work was they pay money for the target to commit crimes. Crimes that they've controlled, like money laundering, like auto theft, where they are in total control. These are police entrapping young people, or people in particular, to commit these crimes. And it's also part of the discrediting of the subject when he comes to trial. Oh, this person commits criminal acts, therefore he must be a criminal. But in fact, when you pay people money to do these things, you are conditioning them and making them feel that it's okay because, hey, there's money at the end of the rainbow. Now, Sebastian Burns and Atif Rafay came back from Bellevue after the murders of the Rafay family, and the press in Bellevue and in Washington made it appear they had fled from Washington to get back to Canada after they'd done this deed. This was not true, but what happened was in Canada, people turned away from them. They thought they were guilty. And so they couldn't get jobs. They were totally discredited, and it made Mr. Big seem all that much more persuasive, because if you're getting paid, at least it's a kind of job. And they paid them in a very interesting way. I shouldn't say them, because Atif Rafay was really not part of this sting operation until the very end. You'd pay, sometimes they'd pay them a lot of money, sometimes they wouldn't pay them, sometimes he paid them, a small amount of money. And that's the most effective way of conditioning. Anyone who's done Psychology 1 knows that if you give the same amount every time, the person or the pigeon eventually gets a little bit bored and used to it. If you don't pay off at all, you won't get the behavior that you want. But if you pay off intermittently, then you get the highest rate of return. The target will be more tempted to come back and do what you want them to do. So that's a long way around of explaining it. There are more elements involved, but suffice to say that Sebastian Burns was entrapped into this, as well as their friend Jimmy Miyoshi.
Right, right. So now, and when you talked about fled, they actually took the bus from Seattle to Vancouver, right? They never, it's not exactly fledding. I mean...
Well, I think the issue is not what bus they took or, how they drove or whatever it was. No, I mean, for me, the issue was they were very clear they were coming back. They told the Canadian embassy, and the Americans knew that they were leaving. But it suited the Americans' purpose, the Bellevue police. They basically allowed them to leave with the idea that they would say they fled. If they had come up and escorted them to the border, then they would have been able to give them a kind of free pass. Okay, they threw us out of Washington. We're back in BC, but they have no evidence that we've committed any crime. But by just leaving it open, they knew that Sebastian and Atif were going to go back to Canada because there was no place for them to be in Washington. Atif had lost his entire family. The house was essentially ruined with fingerprint dust and all kinds of things. There was no way that they were going to stay down there. Sebastian's family lived in West Vancouver, and they came back, and that was exactly where the police knew they would come. I mean, where else are you going to go? You're going to go home.
Right, right. Now, so they go home, and so Sebastian gets caught up in this Mr. Big sting, and gets drawn in by doing things for the undercover police, basically. So where does it come up, the confession, and how, you see, this is a question that will be asked a lot: is how can you confess to something you didn't do? And why would you make up this, the story of how you killed someone or killed people just because of, offers of money and things like that? Maybe, I don't know if you can explain that.
Well, that's an important question. Because it wasn't the offers of money that made Sebastian, quote-unquote, confess. First of all, I don't call what Sebastian did I don't liken it to confessing. When you confess to a crime to a police officer, you're given a warning that anything you say may be used against you in court. That's a Miranda warning. That was, it's a Supreme Court decision from way back. Now, when you're doing Mr. Big, you're talking to a bunch of gangsters. They're not talking to the police. They don't think they're talking to the police. Ergo, they're not talking to the police. They're talking to gangsters or police who are masquerading as gangsters. So what happens is the gangsters say to them, well, you know all of these crooked things that we do because you've participated in them. So now we have to know how we can trust you. And the only way we can trust you is by you telling us what happened in Washington with the Rafay family. And for 5 months, Sebastian denied that he'd done anything to the Rafay family. You don't see that. Those tapes are never seen. The only tapes that are seen in the courtroom are the tapes that show him, quote-unquote, confessing. But if people would look at the Netflix confession tapes, they would see that these were two kids who were kind of full of this criminal braggadocio. Sebastian was trying to appear like a cool customer or whatever, but I think if you look closely, you can just see that his voice is very caught up. He's frightened, but he's also trying to look cool. And I feel like what he did was not really confess, but he gave the gangsters what the gangsters seemed to need. And the story in his mind, as well as Atif's, was completely implausible. That they would commit this crime to get money to make a movie. That they would it's Sebastian who basically took credit for this. They would take a baseball bat or whatever and bludgeon to death an entire family. Two kids who had no criminal backgrounds and no examples of violence in their past. So they had to create, and I say more of Sebastian, had to create a scenario that they thought that the gangsters would accept, because these gangsters were making it clear that, hey, Sebastian, we know where your parents live, we know we could do anything we want to you, and we could also make sure that we treat you in the same way that we've treated some of the others, which was basically to kill them. So Sebastian was frightened. These guys were very, very convincing. And again, I don't consider what they did a confession. I consider it a way of warding off possibly bad consequences. And I also feel, and I'll reiterate it, that the story he told is completely implausible. They were at a movie theater. The neighbors heard the killings take place at the time where they were seen at a movie theater. So, for an example, the RCMP gangster says to him, well, how could you have been at the movie theater and committed this crime? So Sebastian needs to answer that question to please the gangster. And Sebastian says, well, we snuck out the side door. Not that the timing was in any way possible for them to get from Seattle, a Seattle movie theater to Bellevue and commit this crime, but simply that is the only answer he could think of at that moment.
Yeah. Now I have to bring in the prosecution, and their side of it is what they say is the key parts of the confession, as they call it, or him talking on tape, was that they asked how he killed the three, and he said a metal baseball bat, which was true, and they said that wasn't out, so how did he know that? And the other thing they said was that when they took him back for questioning after the murder, they questioned them, and then they scanned them for blood and any residue, and there was nothing on them. So when he was asked by the Mr. Big in the hotel how he could get away without having any blood on him, he said that he did it naked and showered and left. And the luminol tests from the police showed lots of blood that had been in the shower, like it had been exposed to blood. So that was the two key points that they came up with in response to this. How do you answer that?
Well, as to the blood, it could be answered in many ways. The only blood found in the shower, of course, was Mr. Rafay's blood. Why was it in there? The people who did the killing could have washed the murder weapon off in the shower. I don't think that the people who did the killing actually went in there and took a shower, but it's possible. They found Sebastian Byrne's hair in the shower. That would be incriminating if Sebastian hadn't been living there for 3 days, showering in that very bathroom. Frankly, I've never met an adolescent who cleans up the shower stall when they use even in their own home. So that is completely fabricated. That's evidence that's not really evidence. I don't remember your first example there, Al.
Well, they were talking about the metal baseball bat and how it hadn't been out in public, but yet he...
No, that's not true.
Oh, it isn't?
It was out in public. Yes. In fact, an FBI informant and a known FBI informant admitted to being an FBI informant even by Bob Thompson, the police chief, the lead detective in the case. An FBI informant told them that a baseball bat was the weapon that was used, and that he'd actually seen a bat in the back or in the trunk of a car, and he identified the people who showed him this bat. He was, to us, again, when you're an archaeologist and you go back and you look, he was a credible witness, but they discounted him. They called him crazy. This is beyond my understanding, because he was the first person who told them, who gave them a description of the murder weapon, and this was right after the murder. So there's absolutely no truth whatsoever in the fact that Sebastian brought up this baseball bat out of the clear blue sky. It was common knowledge.
So now, what do you suggest that is the problem with police on these cases? And before we get into the Mr. Big itself and the entrapment thought, I'm thinking because, first of all, the detectives like Thompson and the rest of them on the case in Bellevue were focused directly on the two boys. So, so it's because of that it leads to this Mr. Big investigation, because they weren't really looking elsewhere. Their focus was on the boys, and they did it, and how do we get them? How can we fix that issue? Because then they put all the resources toward just the boys. Like there was another defense about his parents praying in the wrong direction and it being a Muslim killing. So now the police never did follow up on that, did they?
I think there was some half-hearted attempt at follow-up. I don't think anything was really chased down. My reading of all, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages of police accounts. They started out with the possibility that there was an Islamic fundamentalist killing because Mr. Rafay was a moderate Muslim, and he believed that people of different religions should talk together. In fact, he was the head of the Canadian Pakistani Friendship Association. This is not something that Islamic fundamentalists are happy about. They don't want to dilute the religion. These are people who believe in the word of the Quran, literal word of the Quran. And this goes around the world. Every religion has its kind of rock-based scripture. And some people believe that scripture is absolute and real, that the solutions of the past apply to the present. Pretty much the U.S. Constitution is somewhat like that, too, the difference between originalists and people who want the document to adjust to the times. The problem begins, as you were saying initially, with the original investigative work. The police fastened onto these two guys because they were the easiest solution. It's called tunnel vision. And what happens in tunnel vision is that the police begin to see patterns and shapes that aren't really there. And they chase down the suspects based on a story they're putting together in their minds. Now, if you were to take the Muslim fundamentalist story, and also by extension here, the Sikh extremists who joined with them, if you could take those stories as the base, you would put together a better overall story about who did this crime. But that's not what they did. They focused on Atif and Sebastian, and anything that led to the target suspects, was taken as proof of guilt. Anything that led away from those suspects was discounted. And as I say, the process is referred to as tunnel vision. It's what caused the incarcerations of Sebastian Burns and Atif Rafay. Their quirky behavior after the murders of the Rafay family was taken as evidence of guilt. And people who saw some of the films of them at the memorial service thought, oh, these two guys, they're totally heartless, they should rot in hell. I mean, you cannot believe the amount of people who felt that they were guilty. I would say when we first came to Vancouver, 99% of the people here just accepted their guilt. And I would say after that Netflix piece, 10 years later, we're definitely in a different world now. I get very few pieces on my website now that say anything about their guilt. It's almost all innocence, and a lot of people have joined the cause. Now, the fact that they were seen in a movie theater again at the time of the killings needed to be explained away. This is, to me, the single most important part of their alibi. So the fact that other suspects were named had to be explained away as somehow crazy or irrelevant or lacking in substance, even though the commission of a crime as bloody as, say, bludgeoning would have to produce some forensic evidence implicating the suspects. I mean, I would think so. You'd have, as you were saying, the luminol tests. No blood in the hair whatsoever. No blood anywhere. Either these were very clever and ruthless killers, Sebastian and Atif, or how could they be so clever and get caught up in this RCMP scheme? I don't know. I don't believe that they did it. In fact, I will say 100% that I know they didn't do it. They did it as much as I could have done it. But I understand where people would be taken in because the story that was told by the police and the prosecutors was more effective than the story that was told by the defense attorneys.
Right, right. And not only that, I mean, I know back in '94 when the murders happened, you know, the whole ISIS and Islam thing wasn't like it is now, so people kind of poo-pooed their counter by saying that it was some sort of religious thing. and also the Making a Murderer and all of that Steve Avery thing comes out, and people are questioning the convictions and false confessions a whole lot more now.
Yeah, well, there are two elements to your comment there. The religious issue. When you hear people talk about the evils of Islamic fundamentalism, first of all, they do that in isolation, and it ties them to people like Donald Trump, who make this seem like the evil empire of the present trying to take over the world. But in fact, again, fanaticism is not rooted in one religion. But the problem for liberals, and I would put myself in that situation. I mean, I would be considered a liberal if I lived in the United States. The problem is if you come out and speak about Islamic fundamentalists and propensity for killing, you're right away put in that political posture of Donald Trump or people on the right. And the problem in the United States, as I see it right now, is everything is in two camps. Either you're for Trump or you're against him, you're on the other side, and nobody's listening to anybody in the middle. Nobody's listening because they're so invested in their camps. So it's hard to come out and talk about Islamic fundamentalists doing this killing. It's alarming and it's terrible, but it wasn't just the Rafay killings. There were killings all around. Certainly, there was a large presence of Islamic fundamentalists in the Seattle area, and by that I mean Bellevue, Renton, Seattle, Tacoma, and these killings, there were killings that were beyond the Rafay family. There were other family killings. There were other murders of this sort, and there were other killings in Vancouver. And the one thing that ties them together, again, we talk about archaeology, the one thing that ties these killings together is that the people who were killed were moderate Muslims, and they were targeted because perhaps they had closer relations to other religions. This is factual. Now, whether that it's coincidental, I don't know, but that's what it appears to us, that they were targeted in that way. So the religious angle is extremely important, and that is a better story, as far as I'm concerned, than two kids killing their family, or two kids, one of them killing his own family for insurance money to make a movie.
Yeah, it's crazy. So now, why did the Americans allow the Canadian Mr. Big operation that was conducted on the boys in Canada, in a foreign country, an operation that would be considered entrapment and illegal and not usable in court in the U.S.? So how could they allow it in the court just because it was done by a different police agency? Like, that's confusing to me, because their own policing, they're not allowed to do such a thing. They couldn't do this operation in Seattle and bring it to court. It just wouldn't happen. So why would they take this, as they call it, illegal operation and wrongful sort of evidence into their courts in this case?
Well, all along, since they had no evidence, they bargained, perhaps, or they thought, and they actually got what they wanted. The judge decided that since the evidence had been gathered in Canada, that it was okay, it was allowable in a U.S. courtroom. I think his decision was wrong-headed, and I think that the appeal decisions were atrocious that backed this up. I think I spoke to a retired judge in Washington, and this retired judge told me that if an appeal court feels that the defendant, or defendants in this case, are guilty, they will not rule against the prosecution on constitutional issues. To me, this is terribly dangerous. To abandon your Constitution in order to mete out justice that you think is correct, this is not the way that the system is supposed to work. And that's why you get a lot of wrongful convictions. But in this particular case, the judge allowed it because it was gathered in Canada. And I think that all along the prosecution felt this was their best bet.
But I still I don't see it as being valid. Not even saying whether they were guilty or not. I just don't see it as being valid. Because what if two gay men were in Syria and they get caught touching each other, and they're Americans, but yet they want to prosecute them under their law in that country, even though it could be I just don't see where you can bring in something that in your country it's illegal. It's not acceptable in your country, but yet you bring it in. It shouldn't. It doesn't make sense to me. That's just one of those things. I don't get how they allowed it. So I think that's wrong.
Well, we agree.
Well, what are the chances now of something changing or having their cases overturned? Now, I understand Burns has already used his appeals up, and I guess Rafay still has one left, and that's what I've read last. I don't know if that's where it stands.
Yes, you're kind of right there. Sebastian is finished on the appeal levels, even the federal appeals. He lost his habeas. So Sebastian has reached the dead end on the appeals level. Whereas Atif has taken every single issue in his case and gone through one personal restraint petition after another, PRPs, in order to build his case for the federal habeas. He is now ready for federal habeas. He's a couple of years behind Sebastian. Now, it is possible for Atif to win his appeal and for Sebastian to stay in prison. It's possible for Atif to be retried and Sebastian not to be included. I don't think this possibility will happen, but it's possible. And the only thing that can get Sebastian out of prison now is new evidence, and that's where we're working. That new evidence all throughout any jurisdiction in the United States can reopen a case, be it DNA or a retracted witness retracting statement. There are a number of grounds that are solid for new evidence. So Atif is not at that point yet, but God, it's going to be awfully hard for Atif to win an appeal, a federal appeal, when Sebastian has lost his. It's going to be a strange situation if that happens. But Sebastian was in no condition to follow up on his appeals the way Atif is. Atif has maintained his kind of intellectual integrity. Somehow he's still a whole person. He got married recently, whereas Sebastian is, to say the least, a lost soul. He spent at least 10 years in solitary confinement, and this is not good for the health of the human soul or the human intellect.
Yeah, it's pretty rough for sure. Now the Supreme Court in Canada has decided to tighten up its rules on the Mr. Big operation. Do you think they'll eventually outlawed or make it so that they can't use such an operation in court for court evidence?
I think they'll outlaw it when they find out how many more cases of wrongful convictions there are. Right now, the RCMP boasts that they've had this huge success rate. But again, if you have a wrongly convicted person sitting in prison whose sentence has not been overturned, they can claim that this was a valid conviction. Even though I know myself of 3 cases in the prisons right now that are highly suspect. I would say one fellow, especially the Skiffington, Wade Skiffington, who was convicted of killing his wife, I think is highly suspect, and I think he will be released. As to the court in Canada outlawing it, I think that will be done in time. As I say, when it's discovered that there are more than a handful of cases involved here. It's a very dangerous thing. And frankly, I think it's an anomaly in the Canadian justice system, which is generally far more progressive than the U.S. states.
Right, right. Well, I'm just wondering if they do eventually outlaw it, if this would have an effect on the Rafay Burns case in the U.S.
It might, but again, if you look at Burns and Rafay, their guilt, which was presupposed and all of that, it was held up in a court of law. And I don't think that it would affect their case, but you can see very clearly that their case would have been disallowed under the present rules. Because there was no substantive evidence, forensic evidence especially, implicating them in the crime, it would have been very hard to justify using this Mr. Big to get a confession. They wouldn't have allowed it, plus the relative youth of the defendants. They were the youngest people who were ever given this treatment, this Mr. Big sting. And, you know, young people, the age of 18, 19, their judgment is fairly poor. Perhaps poorer in some ways than a 15 or 16-year-old. Their judgment is poor. Their hormones are running high. They don't think clearly. There is a lot of developing going on in the brain. So they were too young to be entrapped in this scheme, and they were also, there was not sufficient evidence to justify it. Doesn't mean that would in any way overturn their cases in Washington, but people can see already that this was not a legitimate use of the Mr. Big sting.
Wow. So now let's give the audience some information. How do they get a hold of if they want to help in these sort of cases? Where should they go? Well,
online, there's the RafayBurnsAppeal.com. RafayBurnsAppeal.com has handled since the confession tapes, I have to say, 500-600 various and sundry responses, offers for help, and in fact we're utilizing 15 people right now in terms of finding new evidence in this case. That's all the results of the confession tapes. But even before that, there was plenty of traffic. I mean, my website, KenKlonsky.com, has had a lot of traffic. Anyone who goes on there can see the amount of debates over this thing that's gone on over a 10-year period, actually about 8-year period that the website's been up. And you can see how the attitudes toward them have changed. So if they wanted to help, I think the best way is RafayBurnsAppeal.com.
Fantastic. Now, and your books are available at bookstores and Amazon, and we'll have it on our site as well.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, the other case is not about Burns and Rafay. It's about David McCallum, and I think we're going to talk with him on Wednesday. He'll be on as well as I. But the David McCallum case was far different, and yet it also relied on false confessions. That's what links them together.
Yeah. I look forward to talking to him and talking to you. Well, it's been an interesting show, and I think there's going to be a lot more talk about this in the future. I mean, I hope there is. I hope people can get on this and get some change happening, because we're taking away people's freedom, and I think we need to take it more serious. We need to have better evidence when you're going to take away someone's freedom for their life.
Yes, and using a bit of imagination, you put yourself in their places. The door closes on you. You're stuck inside prison. 3 99-year consecutive sentences. 297 years in prison. This is such a despairing thing, and the state of Washington not having a parole system makes it even more despairing.
Wow, it's just amazing. So there's no parole system at all in Washington State?
There is not. You have to serve your sentence. This is a situation that I don't understand, but that is the way it is.
Wow, that's crazy, eh? Well, our guest has been Ken Klonsky. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Al, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.